everyone, and welcome back to the Truth in Data podcast, where we delve into a different digital forensics topic each week. This week, we're going to be really talking about how to address the backlog, a really big issue in many forensics labs. Hi, I'm Jessica.
I'm Kim.
And I'm Debbie.
So let's get started. What is going on with backlogs in forensics? What have you all seen in your career?
This is something that's consistent. I know when I started at the Child Exploitation and Computer Crimes Unit with the GBI, we had a backlog, and over the 8 years that I was there, our backlog was occasionally 2 months. It all the way up to 2 years.
Yeah, I've worked
And
2 years.
yes,
I've worked in
yes.
labs where it was 2 years.
So, how do you deal with that? How did we get there? Why does it fluctuate so much? All of those things. Kim, like, what were your backlogs?
Yeah, so I mean, we were really in the same boat where we had, sometimes years worth of backlog that was there, and then also, you have to kind of have some approaches, unique approaches at how to deal with that, right? Because and we'll get into some of that a little bit more as we talk, but it does require you to do some out of the box thinking at times. But as we had said when we were talking about doing this episode, how do we get here? How do we end up with this backlog?
Let's do it. Let's go through the 5 Ws, right? Because there might even be folks, especially folks who are newer, maybe they're studying digital forensics, maybe they're just enthusiastic. So let's go through the 5 Ws. What do we mean when we say backlog?
A backlog in digital forensics is sort of like a growing number of unprocessed digital evidence items sometimes you can estimate what your backlog is, but it is a number of evidence items that have not yet been processed.
Yeah, and when we're estimating it and we're saying 2 years, typically what we're saying is that there is evidence that is up to 2 years old that has not yet been processed. And I've noticed things go in waves, and then sometimes we come to technological solutions that reduce it, and then there are changes in technology that cause the backload to increase, and so there's sometimes this accordion effect. And yeah, okay, so that's what a backlog is. So now we'll go to the why do we have this problem of growing backlogs in labs?
I think this is going to be, this is going to be, I was going to say twofold. It's going to be manyfold in terms of why, because one, more devices in the world. There are more devices that are out there now. There are more, those devices can hold more data.
Mm-hmm.
And and when I say devices, I mean sources really of where we're getting this data and what we need to process and what we need to do. So it's not just a laptop and computer anymore. If you go to do a search warrant, Debbie, do you come out with 8 cell phones and a laptop maybe, and then maybe there's some cloud data and maybe even some warrant returns you got to process. I mean, there's a lot more to this than just, oh, let's go get their computer, right?
Sure.
Gone are those days.
Yeah, wearables, cameras, vehicles now. It's, mobile phones are in almost every case, but all of these other sources of digital data help create the backlog.
Yeah.
There's a lack of resources also. If we're talking about the why, of course, I'm always going to talk about the lack of resources. That's just what we lived. Law enforcement in general, a lot of times has insufficient funding, staffing shortages, limited infrastructure, not just meaning a digital forensics lab, but their IT system, so complexities of digital evidence also. So, all of these things, and I'll throw in one more: lack of standardization and best practices.
Ooh, yes.
So, I know that the industry has come a long way and is trying to standardize some processes and procedures, but there's still across the industry and across agencies, there's a lack of standardization and best practices.
I think that's a really, really good point in terms of the fact that, we got here because there's a lack of an issue with best practices. I know recently there's been a couple of articles. I know, Kim, you found some regarding both how academia is handling this, how actual labs are handling this, how consultancy is handling this. Do you want to talk a little bit about how some of the different approaches that are being made towards addressing backlog issues are? Maybe there's something that can help someone who's listening.
Sure. So I think people are going to have to get creative. And I think that's the whole point of, why, in sharing several of the links that I did with you all, is that it's not a one size fits all,
Mm-hmm.
and people are going to have to look at their situation for what it is and try to address it the best that they can. And the way they address it is not necessarily the best way that another agency may address it. Right. And I think that's the one thing, is that it's not always going to be, oh, here's how to fix your backlog, right?
Exactly. Yes.
So, and I think that is a big challenge for folks, is that oftentimes you're looking for, we're all smart people, right? In digital forensics, we're looking for the answers. And when you look around at what other people have done, that may not work for you, and that's okay. But let's figure out what will work for you. Think it through in terms of, is the best thing for you to do. One agency I know, they drew a line in the sand and they said, you know what? We're toward the end of the year this year. Let's say that it was like August-ish. Don't work on anything prior to the beginning of this year. Let's just start at the beginning of this year, and we'll start from here. And these are the ones we're working, and get all that up to being done, right? To it being finished. And then if you were to get some type of a call that says, hey, this is going to trial, or we need to prepare for a defense review, or whatever that may be, okay, then let's go back a year or so before, whenever we need to go back and grab those and bring those here. But if your agency is like a lot of other agencies, you may have a situation where these may have been adjudicated a while back and you don't necessarily know it. You may be sitting there with this year's worth of backlog, and a percentage of those aren't even ever going to need to be done.
That was a huge issue in our lab. Nobody would notify us that the case had been adjudicated, and we still had evidence that we thought we had to process.
Right. And so there goes the 3 pillars, right? I like to call them the 3 Ps. And you've got personnel. Do we have the people with the technical skills and capabilities to be able to do the work? Then you have procedures. Do our procedures account for the fact that we even know which things should be processed and looked at? Which things have already been adjudicated? What are our best practices for handling things in our lab to ensure that things are being processed properly in the right orders by the right personnel? And then products, which is what tools and technologies are there that you can bring into the workplace to help supplement. And really, it's all 3.
I'm going to add another P, and it kind of goes. It kind of goes back to what Kim was saying. Prioritization.
Prioritization. Yes.
So, Kim was talking about one method that they were using to prioritize their cases, and prioritization can affect your backlog. So, a lot of, some labs will prioritize based on political reasons. Some will, on the whether it's a high profile case. Some will do recency or time in the backlog.
When I was working counterterrorism, it was prioritization was based on national security risk.
Right.
Like
that's a good one.
And that's a good one. And as a risk changed, I would say sometimes it was frustrating as an examiner, because you might be nearing completion on a case, and then your priority would shift because a more imminent threat was available, and maybe that other threat had been resolved. So we would actually just cease work sometimes on cases to move on to a higher priority as something came in. And sometimes we would go back to those, or sometimes they would actually be just sent to other organizations to process at some point. But yeah, prioritization. So, all right. So personnel, right? Our people, our personnel and people, our procedures and policies, our products, procurement and pocketbook.
Oh, wow.
Right? Triple P there. And then our prioritization.
Some alliteration going on.
Yeah, we got some alliteration. So we've got lots of P's. And we have to be able to tackle them. And depending on your lab, you may not be able to get more people or properly train your people, or you may
Or
not be able
products.
to get products or procure them, but you can adjust procedures and you can look at new methods of prioritization. In one lab I was in, we actually had to come up with a scoring matrix for how we were going to prioritize.
Oh,
And we actually made a objective formula that on our intake forms we were able to get in enough information to determine it. And so it had to do with the threat risk, right? Like how high of perceived priority is this? When is the due date of when it's needed? What is the amount of data? But also, what is the complexity? Can this be handled by another, um, by someone else? Meaning, is this something that could be done without a digital forensics examiner, where maybe an investigator could review the data, or it could be pushed out for analysis before a deep dive? Um, and so we would look at multiple factors, and we would actually, including complexity of the case, and we would use that to create a objective score ranking. And so once the data was triaged, we were able to determine where it fell in our prioritization based on that matrix, along with the priorities that were coming in from overhead. So all of that was scored and ranked together, and that's actually how we did our assignment of what cases we were taking out of the backlog. But it took us a while to develop our formula for our specific lab. And I think the thing I want to make clear here is the priority of the lab is not necessarily the order in which you assign things, because complexity and skill set can also
right.
have to do with that. So how things are being pulled. Also, do you have someone assigning or examiner self-selecting from the backlog? Those are two different methodologies as well.
Hmm.
But I think every lab has to figure out their prioritization matrix and determine how they can make it objective and not just subjective, which is the whole reason that we had built this scoring matrix.
That would be
You
an
know,
interesting project to come up with a considerations for prioritization resource.
I
Yeah.
think that would be great for folks. You said something very important there. You said triage, which a lot of folks in a lot of labs, where they receive something, they're receiving something. Maybe it's a lab where you're taking in evidence not just from your own agency, but from other agencies as well.
Yep.
And so when you receive those, you may just have the evidence, the evidence officer or whoever it may be that's bringing that to you. That may not even be the investigator, right? So you may just have somebody who's planning to bring it over and just, leave it
Drop
at your
it.
doorstep, essentially. Yeah. And then walk off and leave it. But some folks, that is one way that they are addressing their backlog, is sort of a triaging and making this arrangement that when evidence is dropped off, is that they do a triage so that they're not taking this in to go sit in this huge growing pile of evidence that they have that they don't know if it's ever going to be needed again necessarily, but they do some triaging, and depending on what it is, they may be able to easily, say, okay, this one isn't needed, it doesn't have what you need, or the person maybe who collected it doesn't even know how to figure out if it's what they're going to need for their case or not.
Right.
So that's one of the strategies that I've spoken with some folks in labs that have done, and they've said that that's helped them considerably. Oh, go ahead, Debbie, because then.
No, I was just going to say that's an interesting insert into the process, because it's somewhere in between on-scene triage and actual just dropping it off and somebody processing it later. There's like an initial triage on drop off.
But that's
Is that
exactly
what that's really, I mean, that's interesting. I like
that's
that.
exactly what I was talking about the intake form, having the right questions to help prioritize.
Mm-hmm.
Because a lot of times those questions can be determined. Do we know if there is a pending court date? Do we know if this is in support of multiple organizations? I will say sometimes people need to recognize, if they're submitting their data to a secondary agency, that the fact that they are not the primary agency may be affecting where they are in their ranking. And as they're looking to maybe
Yes.
fund having capabilities or tools at their labs, because sometimes we send things to other labs because another lab has a capability that we do not.
Right.
When you're sorting for that funding, understanding how your data is being prioritized elsewhere can also help you
True.
in that fight for funding. Like, sure, our data, we need to get an extraction from a tool that our lab cannot afford. And so we are sending it off to this other lab. Kick back to episode one.
Right.
The data is being lost because it's not being adjudicated as quickly because we now understand the lab we're sending it to's priority workflow, and then how is that affecting us in cases, and then is it really worth us relooking at our funding to bring the capability in house so we can control our own prioritization.
Yes.
Yeah, all that's what has to be considered, right? But so this is in our world, we're in the digital forensics world, right? But this isn't new to forensics in general, right? Because a few years ago, what was the hot topic? It was rape kits. Rape kits were taking years to get through and to get processed.
Yep.
And so then, it's kind of shifted over now. Now it's in our world and it's our issue. But yeah, it's unfortunate that, science, I guess, because as things kind of gain in need of, those scientific forensic processes, whatever the subdiscipline that we have here, they end up kind of with these ebbs and flows and where they're, the kind of the hot topic backlog is, and it happens to be us right now.
Well, and every single type of case has digital evidence now. When I started in this field, that wasn't true. Not, computer crimes had computer evidence, right? But now every type of case has digital evidence, or most cases have digital evidence. It's rare not to. And in the instances where they don't, the lack of digital evidence in itself becomes digital evidence.
Becomes
in
evidence.
those cases. So it's obvious why it's our problem now. So I know that there are some reports that have come out recently. So there was the Cellebrite report that came out on digital
The industry
trends.
trends. Industry trends survey.
And what was kind of the results there?
So they did talk about the backlog and the impact on investigations. And in their survey, the people in their survey, which was a wide variety of personas, they came up with 3 to 4 weeks of digital forensic examination backlogs.
That's excellent.
I thought that was pretty good.
I'm happy with that. I'm very happy to hear
I was surprised at that. But then again, there's agencies across the country who probably don't have backlogs. And if I had to guess, this is just Debbie's guess, those are smaller agencies.
Yeah.
That have a digital forensics capacity. And they are, they have a 3 to 4 week backlog.
I looked at the article that came out. It's a 2023 article about how Deloitte was awarded a £2.3 million contract for digital forensics to help the police digital service in the UK and to help their digital forensics program. And they said that there were 25,000 unexamined devices. That is a lot of devices. So what are some of the ways that we know of or that we've heard of in which agencies have actually gone about tackling this problem?
So one in particular, actually, I've known a couple that have done this, and they were at a great advantage because while they are larger agencies, they typically only do their own agency's digital evidence. However, they're very large agencies, and where they have a lot of their successes have come from training the folks on the front line to know what to take and how to bring the evidence to them in what state that it needs to be in so that they can get the best type of extraction. The part that I'll say to that is that they're trained there on the intake of it, but they are trained in how to look at that data. So they're helping to cut down the amount of time that the examiner has to spend doing almost
right.
Some folks will call it analysis, but really it's almost an investigative part of it. And I know we're splitting hairs here, but it's where if you could show an investigator how to sit down and take a look at that, you're taking that time away from the examiner to do other things. So that's really where it's kind of bookended with two different ways that they've had other folks involved. There are really people that are involved in the case rather than the exam, if you will. And the examination portion was able to be more defined in what they needed. And also, instead of those folks knew better than to come in and hand them a device and say, give me everything, which was always an examiner's,
Oh my gosh.
nightmare.
Tell me what's wrong.
And yeah. And so, rather than them coming in and saying, give me everything, they were able to say, between this amount of time, this is what I need.
Right.
And then they were able to narrow down to hand them something back that they could go through.
That they could go through and use.
So I'll comment on two things that you said. First of all, big fan of on-scene triage. So huge fan of triaging things prior to they ever getting to the lab, because there's so often we just don't take things. We take things that we don't need. But you said something really interesting. There are agencies where there will be acquisition, extraction of data, and putting it in a format where an investigator can go through it.
Yep.
Really, what the investigator wants is information and leads to continue their investigation often. And yes, will an examiner still have to look at the data further? Absolutely. But there is a lot of value.
Not.
Yes.
Maybe not. Maybe the prosecutor and the investigator have enough to get a plea.
Yes, exactly.
Maybe an examiner never even needs to touch that case.
But having an investigator be able to, and there's tools now, some of the tool providers are creating tools that an investigator can look at data, more effectively. But having an investigator look at data is a way to help with the backlog.
So let's talk about the fact that this is being done well in a lot of e-discovery worlds, where a lot of the e-discovery tools, I know, Kim, I know you're familiar with relativity, and we both have done that kind of work in our career on the non-government side, where you have paralegals and other people determining what's responsive. You're using things like targeted assisted review, TAR, to surface what is responsive based on what else is responsive. So there's both a tooling and a procedural and a policy thing that's kind of existed in the e-discovery world, where there's this recognition that the information that is relevant, that is already parsed, could be determined by people who know the contextual information about the investigation. And then it comes back to the forensics examiner, and this is how it was when I was at EY, to do the deep dive on the digital forensics, provide the attribution, and then from there, once you also have that context of what was of interest to the folks who are determining what's responsive, be it an investigator, an attorney, etc., you can then look for the other relevant data within that scope that wasn't parsed by the tools. So I think it's important to have this secular workflow. And some people, when they hear that, they think it's actually going to make the process longer. But what it does is it actually reduces people to doing the functions they know well and to doing their specialties. So by having a collaborative environment, people go, oh, but then multiple people are touching the data. Yes, but multiple people are touching the parts of the data that they know. But in order to do that, you need the right people, you need the right policies on the prioritized cases, and you do need tooling that supports that.
We've talked about what you're talking about too is communication between examiner and investigator. So, and we've talked about that before. Yeah, we had our P's. Now we have C's as context, collaboration, communication.
Ooh.
So those are all. We can call this our alliteration episode. So, but those are all critical. And I do think that an examiner and an investigator, if they're not the same person, collaborating and really communicating during the examination process, it will actually help things move faster.
I think I agree. And I also think that, I mean, we've talked about, the examiner and the investigator being able to communicate well, but I think also that, prosecutors also need to be on board and
Mhm.
need to be able to understand this digital
Absolutely.
evidence well enough so that they'll know. And then also, I've talked to many examiners where they'll say things like, if they're working a CSAM case where they'll say, this particular computer had, 400,000 images on it that were illegal images. And, they know that by the hash sets. So then how much is enough, right? How much more do they need to go digging
Varies.
through? And,
There's
but
so many
some
different policies.
agencies, yet some agencies have policies that say they have to continue to look through all
Find
of it,
everyone.
And how does
find
that
it
affect
all,
the backlog? Yeah.
Definitely affects
The,
the
the
backlog.
but how
policy.
much is enough?
How much is enough? How much is enough? There was a great quote from O.V. Carroll. He had given a talk, I think at the Magnet User Summit, the first one that took place in Nashville. He had the
2019.
opening keynote 2019, yes. And in that keynote, he stated, if you were to go through a 2 terabyte drive and look at every byte, you would spend 1 year on that single case. And it's absolutely true. We cannot look at every single byte. We have to look at the bytes that are relevant, and we have to be able to determine that and have the right people in the right portion of the workflow looking at the right bytes, or we're not going to get through the workflow. Because and the problem is like the cases that I personally tend to work at this point in my career are the rabbit hole portions, right? The portions where I am 10 levels deep into something very specific that requires a lot of testing. But that's not all cases, and that's not all evidence. And it's important to remember that we need to do what is sufficient
Right.
on each case. But at the end of the day, if data's setting in backlogs, then we're not doing what's right for those cases and those evidence. And
Yeah,
there are real victims for every case that's worked.
how are you able to sit there and, I mean, I know that you, a lot of times the argument is, well, you might be missing something. Yeah,
We
but
might be
what
missing
about
a
the one I'm never
victim.
going to get to?
That's the argument that I generally make, because the arguments on both sides, like you said, is okay, if we don't go through all of the images, we may miss a victim and we owe it to that
100%.
victim. I understand that argument, but the other side is exactly what you said, Kim. There are plenty of victims also sitting in the backlog. So, those are decisions and prioritizations that we make, every day, and they're not easy. They're not easy decisions.
I'm going to say something you might think is controversial. This is why it is critical that defense has defense examiners, because as law enforcement has to be very specific with their time because of the number of cases. Every single person who is being charged with a crime has a right to have their case looked
Yes.
at to ensure that anything that's exonerative isn't missed. Now, it is the duty of all examiners, regardless of if you're working civil, criminal, prosecution, defense, it is the responsibility to find exculpatory and inculpatory evidence, but at the end of the day, not every bite can be looked at. So, since everyone goes in with unintentionally or intentionally, because we're human beings, we have bias. If you are looking for something, and as the scope of your examination, you are looking for it. Yes, we have the responsibility to look for also what else could have caused that and be able to speak to that. But that is why it's important that people have representation, regardless of what side of the table they're on, so that we ensure that the fact that law enforcement has to go quick because of the backlog, that people are still getting due process and that the evidence is being looked at appropriately. And I think everyone has a right to a defense and an examiner who is representing their interests and ensuring that we're looking at the data from that perspective.
I don't think that's controversial at all.
I would hope not, but sometimes people get offended because they're like, we're supposed to be unbiased, and we are. But when we're dealing with time pressures, it is very, very difficult to be able to take a complete approach. to look at every bite because that is impossible with time demands, right? So
It
that
is.
is one of the reasons that it's critical that everyone have someone working on their behalf.
Agreed.
So, I do want to bring up an interesting one. There was a case study out of Nashville that was written, was posted by Magnet, but it was from Chris Dickerson, Chad Gish, and Jan Norman. And I know, Kim, you know some of those folks. I know that you're not too far from Tennessee, and of course, many of us know Chad. Chad's a great, dear person and friend in the community. And they were having a problem where they were getting a 40% increase year over year, according to their case study, of how many devices they were receiving. And so, what they had to do was adjust their procedures and their tooling to be able to bring in a process where imaging and processing was being done 24 by 7, 365, regardless of if there was an examiner working. And I think that that's a really key point, which is man time versus machine time. Machines can run all the time. So if you're looking at your lab and you are using a traditional process where you've got a left knee machine that's processing and a right knee machine that's analyzing, and you're processing one case while analyzing the next, which is how many of us have traditionally worked, that might not be the most efficient method. It may be much more efficient to have all cases going through a processing queue and then you pick up an analysis. And then you're working in that cyclical format. So a lot of times we actually have to look at our IT policies, our equipment. How can we best leverage and manage our equipment? I've worked with some labs where we pulled hardware out of Dermo that was no longer being used, that was meant for demolition, and said, why can't we just turn those into part of a processing form? Just make it nodes. It doesn't even matter if they're weaker machines. Let's add, right? And so there's a lot of times different things that can be done so we can do more things in parallel, so we can use more appropriate usage of even the devices and machines that we have.
That's a
Right.
good point.
And I'll tell you, this kind of goes back to what we talked about before about communication and people working together, because the three people you just mentioned there, Jan Norman is the prosecutor, Chris Dickerson is the investigator, and I think he's a sergeant, maybe lieutenant now, and Chad Gish was an examiner. So we had those three different roles that were represented there that were working well together to make that happen and to understand each other's needs so that they could try to eliminate that and to be willing to think outside the box and to implement things that is not necessarily what they were used to or comfortable with, and have to go back and retrain some folks and have to educate a few people. But in the long run, it ended up that they were able to cut their backlog down.
And I'm sure it'll go into, I'm sure we'll have a future episode on this, but I applaud New York State Police. I saw a presentation recently from Brian there that was addressing the fact that they have changed and adapted their procedures to take advantage of cloud processing. And, so it may be even in order to deal with backlogs, looking at, and his entire presentation wasn't just about the fact that they were processing it in the cloud. It was about their entire evaluation of how do we as a police agency that has to deal potentially with data that is not allowed to be stored on servers and computers. How do we deal with that in the cloud? And do we actually need to move to the cloud? Does it make sense financially? Does it make sense? What are the costs? How do we manage it? How do we make sure that we keep it secure? Will it actually give us the process improvement that we're looking for? Or will the change take us offline in such a way that we wind up with an even bigger backlog? So in addressing the backlog, I really like that different agencies are trying to look at unique methods to deal with things. But it's not just the agencies that are looking at this, right? Academia is looking at this as well. I know there was Kim, you had pointed out a paper from Mark Scanlon, who's out of University of Dublin. Did you want to speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, so and really just from the standpoint of deduplication was really what it was around.
Okay.
And that was the main, just to wrap it up and not get super technical on much of it, but
It's a very technical paper, but that's Mark Scanlon. Mark's a genius.
But I think that also goes along with us using technology to be able to cut down in what we're needing to look at, and the numerous ways to do that. Like I said, is it a date range that you're going to do this? Are we using some hash values to cut down on the amount of, system files that you don't need to look at? Are we doing that to flag to have it cut down on the amount of CSAM that you look at, because those are flagged and kind of put in their own little corner? I mean,
that
what
can
are
even
we
help us
doing
with
to try to
data
help that?
storage, right? It's not even just time. That also helps us with storage, which is huge because storage is a cost. So I love that. And I love that academia is looking at it. And his paper cited that the average backlog times were 6 months to 1 year, which I think is important also to note that's where we are. And also, if we're not doing things quickly, I mean, the backlog has real consequences on real lives. This means that children can still be being harmed. It means justice isn't being served. It means victims are still suffering, knowing that there's bad out there. It means that innocent people can be sitting in prison waiting for their trials while we don't process evidence because evidence hasn't been processed. And at the end of the day, it turns out that they are found innocent and they still have lost time from their lives, sometimes years,
and money. Sometimes that's money.
And that could cause job, loss of family, emotional distress. So really, these backlogs have real implications on the accused, on victims, and on potential victims. Because if we're talking about child sexual abuse, I mean, there is the potential that there are now new victims who are being abused in a time frame because someone is able to continue to do things while we wait. So the real harm to the wrongly accused and to victims and to justice as a whole exists. So it is almost like a moral imperative and an ethical imperative upon us as a community to figure out the best ways to reduce backlog. And
right.
It's
a
hard problem.
It is a hard problem.
And, I've known it in some, I've heard this from a couple of different agents who said that their agency head was subpoenaed to had to go to court because of their digital forensics backlog and why a case couldn't get processed and they couldn't provide digital evidence results. And I've heard that from a couple of different agencies that their agency had to go speak to this. And a few of them had some very good, or a couple of folks had some really good answers to that, responses. And it, one of them in particular did go back to exactly what you're talking about in terms of, this is a larger problem than just having one person go sit and answer for this on why their people can't do this. It's bigger than that.
And of course, rules and laws are different around the world. I know in Canada, they have very tight timelines for evidence to the Crown. It's very, very, very tight deadlines, and they have had to take strong measures to be expedient in talking to examiners from Canada as we travel to countries and have our digital forensics meetings, etc. But I know that this problem is handled differently in different parts of the world. So if you're out there, we definitely would love to hear your comments and what you're doing to address the backlog. We don't want these conversations that Debbie, Kim, and I, and sometimes a guest, are having to be just amongst the three of us. We're hoping to spur conversation in the community. We're hoping to involve more and bring up ideas and thoughts and get people talking about these issues.
Especially if there's solutions.
There are issues and there are solutions, but I think something really key from the beginning is that there's not a blanket solution for this problem. No. Right? No. And it's not just one part. You can't just go, well, I bought this fancy tool that does processing in the cloud. That doesn't necessarily solve your problem. Or, we've changed our SOP, or we're ensuring our personnel are properly trained, or we got more billets for manpower. And then we add in the complexity of the ever looming budget cuts.
Right.
I
Yes.
mean, this is a reality, and then we have to go, where do we cut? Do we cut training? Do we cut tooling? Do we cut, at Hex Audio we teach with all open source and freeware, but I'll be the first to admit open source and freeware does add time, right? A lot of times some of the open source and freeware is very, very quick. It's because we're teaching you how to work cases, not what tools to use, how to think and how to do things. And you need to do that when you need to deep dive stuff. But automated tooling makes things faster, right? So yeah, sure, you could nix your tool budget, but then you are going to increase
It's not going to help your backlog.
Right. It's
No.
going to have the opposite effect. And if you lose personnel, or, I've seen agencies when somebody retires, that's it. They don't get a new body, right? As somebody, there's no funding to provide somebody new, or even organizations that are doing layoffs, and that is happening in digital forensics. There's just the truth that budgets get cut. And then also every year, what happens to the prices on our paid tools? They go up. And when prices go up, that sometimes means you need to make the decision about which tool you're going to cut, because the prices on all the tools went up, but your budget didn't. And
Right.
so,
And then does that allow you to add more people or to, do something additional that you didn't have, or
but
get
what
more
can you
equipment that you didn't
do?
have?
What can you do that's smart to get around this, right? I mean, I know, Debbie, you've done a lot at looking at how to get grants, and I know you have a upcoming NCCC talk and a techno talk,
About
both
funding.
about funding for labs. So I encourage people who are going to either the National Cybercrime Conference or to Techno Security, May and June respectively, to check out Debbie's talk on that. There's a lot of things we can do, and we just need people to think outside the box,
Right.
because even if you're getting hit with cuts, there are things you can do, but we need to share the ideas we have and the things we're doing with each other. I think that again, the collaboration amongst us as a community is really critical, and we have to look at all of these different opportunities, and it may mean that you're challenging the status quo. I'd say,
That's okay.
yeah,
Let's
and
do
that's
Yeah.
it.
okay. Let's challenge the status quo. Let's do it. Let's do it to be. We are in an industry that involves change. Data,
Daily.
storage changes daily. New devices, new apps, new technologies. If we can't adapt our procedures and our policies to match the times, how can we continue to work in an industry that has such rapid change?
I
Agreed.
agree. And I'll add one last thing, because Debbie, I know you and I've had big discussions and you've done sessions on this as well at different times, but the backlog it's a problem, right? I mean, as we've said, for justice in the process, and that it's, is supposed to, serve. And it's also difficult, I feel like, for examiners having this overwhelming, I'm never going to get done with anything feeling. It's sometimes overwhelming for some folks. I mean, some folks they may thrive in that, and I get it. Some folks, though, it may be very daunting for them, right?
Absolutely.
So I think that's another thing, is that the backlog, it carries its weight with the people who are trying to work within that as well. And then also, I think my other thing is, some people are drowning so far that they can't even maybe think of any of these little things, or they look at some of these labs that have come up with really good solutions. They're like, well, good for them. We could never this, we could never that, we could never this, we could never that. I get it. But maybe one of those things might help you
But
a
even
little.
just
Do one thing.
prioritization, even just making a scoring matrix for how you're going to prioritize and what you're going to work, to do that, yeah, you probably need to dedicate a couple of hours to actually drafting that out with your team and figuring out how to best do that within your organization and with your leadership. But that is a no cost way of being able to at least identify, what do I tackle today and in what order do I tackle. And that in itself can relieve a lot of that
And feel
stress
good about it.
and feel good
Because,
about it, right?
right.
So yes, you can, and I would say also it is imperative. we're talking about the changing in technology. Check out what the other solutions out there are on the market that could help you with any of these parts, because maybe a case management system will help you better prioritize. Maybe an Excel spreadsheet isn't working for you, and that prioritization and being able to get a handle on that, maybe that helps even in itself. Maybe your problem is really could be addressed by just looking and talking to other agencies. Maybe you could be reaching out and having conversations, at with other people in the community. Reach out, HTCIA, IASIS, the Discord server. There's so many groups with listservs. Maybe another agency has already had the same challenge and solved that problem, and they can help you. Every agency's challenge is unique, but maybe there's another agency who had, nope, we can't go to cloud, and here's what we did.
Right.
Or maybe another agency had, we don't have any money to bring in a case management system, and this is what we did. Or maybe another agency has, we had no method of communication, and then we actually brought in this tool for some other purpose, and we realized that suddenly we were communicating better, or we changed this policy. Let's just have those again. I guess, like you said, we started in the P's and now we're in the C's, right? Have the conversations amongst our community so that we can all, and I guess that's the point of this podcast.
Yes, we didn't start this podcast with an answer or a one size fits all.
Well, that's the
We
whole
started
point.
this podcast as a conversation.
Well, when we release this podcast, we should pose the question: what have you done to help with your backlog? Do you have some great ideas?
So I wonder, this would actually be pretty simple. Why don't we can pose a conversation and let's have a discussion offline about this after the episode, but let's figure out the best way to maybe put out a way for people to share their ideas in that regard.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I don't want it to be something like a Google form because we might not be seeing the collaborative responses and answers, but let's come up with a way to be able to see that.
This is so important.
People can share. I mean, this could be just a topic that we can post on the LinkedIn when we post it. But let's find as many ways to get people sharing their thoughts, and maybe we can make a future episode if we get enough feedback of what people have done, sharing some of those responses about what different labs have done. So, very cool. Well, I want to thank everyone for listening, and I hope you've enjoyed this. We'll include all those resources, including the Cellebrite survey and the results from that, the information about Nashville's backlog, about the consultancy that Deloitte did, the paper from Mark Scanlon. We'll put all those resources in the show notes, and we thank you all for listening and joining us, and we'll see you next time. Bye all.
Bye.
Bye.